Good evening, everyone. Great stuff. All right. We're continuing our lesson from Sunday in the book, The Minor Prophets, the study we've been doing for quite some time now. We've made it nearly to the end after Zephaniah tonight. We have 3 more minor prophets to do. And then we'll be finished with the whole collection. So it might be time to start thinking about what we want to do next, in addition to wrapping things up here. One of the first things we should talk about as we finish up the book of Zephaniah is a little bit of reflection on what we have looked at so far. The minor prophets, as we have noted on multiple times, are minor only in length and not in significance or in spiritual depth. They have just as much to say as any of the other books of the Bible. One of the things we have managed to do as we go through these books too, and in my opinion, is do a little bit of a review on what we just got through a few months back with the story. Because it's been very much now remember who we're talking about here, and putting things into historical context. And really, I didn't realize, until we got into the Minor Prophet study, how much the story had helped put that timeline actually usefully into my brain in a way for us to actually get something out of. I have often struggled, and still do to certain extents, with locating things in this sort of biblical historical timeline. I've never been much of one for numbers, so memorizing them sequentially based on that was always an outside possibility. But the gaps in my understanding are still there, especially when it comes to the sort of factual aspects of the spiritual record. I can look at any particular point in spiritual history and tell you just about what the Bible is trying to teach us from a point in history. Well, it definitely does not hurt to know what it was teaching the people who were going through it and what God was saying at the time when a particular book was written. It reminds me a little bit of what I went through today. I had a student come after he finished his regular classwork for my class and say, "Can you help me with my homework for this other class?" And he pulled out a map of Europe from 1914. He's going through World War I in his history class, and he said, make a map and make this map of Europe make sense, label it with everything. But this is kind of how I am with the biblical stuff. It's encapsulated pretty well in what I went through with this kid. Because first of all, they didn't call it the Weimar Republic; they called it Germany. There was no Germany in 1914. There was a Weimar Republic. It hadn't been turned into Germany yet. Now, they had Austria-Hungary labeled correctly, but then when they had, some of the other places labeled, they were in anachronistic names, and they had an arrow pointing up into the area between, the peninsula where the Scandinavian countries come down, and then the Russian, and there was an arrow pointing into that area of body of water, and I'm like, I only remember country borders. I don't remember names of bodies of water. And it was just like exemplified how much I know and how much I don't know right next to each other, right? I picked out an error that they made, but at the same time I was still missing information. And a lot of times when I get into biblical history, I do the same thing. I'm like, now wait a minute, this part I know, but that part I don't. And that leads me into the thing I'd like to talk about as we start talking about Zephaniah. Zephaniah, in his 3rd chapter here, God and his people are personified as almost, as I mentioned on Sunday morning, a warrior and the woman he is saving from danger. They kind of got this sort of knight in shining armor and damsel in distress dynamic almost, where God professes, or rather the people profess God's deep love for Zion on his behalf, which is not that uncommon in biblical poetry. You'll remember in the Song of Solomon maybe that Solomon's friends tell his wife how much he loves her just as much as Solomon does. That there was this sort of like, you guys are great together kind of thing that was going on. We've almost got a little bit of that here too. But in saying that imagery and things that we look at, we might allegorize, we might add our own perspective into, and we might lose some things. Because God, the warrior coming in to save Zion, this is a pre-exilic prophecy. This is a taking away into another country to be punished for their sins. And God is still portrayed as this loving, mighty warrior. We, on the other side of that history, can see how God loved us and rescued us by sending Jesus. But those people were about to go through the thing that God was going to rescue them from. They hadn't even been taken away yet. So this image of God had an entirely different meaning to them. And what I'm saying by saying that is, we have to be careful of the two things that humans always have: preconceived ideas and gaps in understanding. We bring those into the Bible every time we open its pages. We imagine certain things to be true, and then we fill in what we don't know, either with what we assume or with something we make up. Those are the two options. And what that has led to over time is I had to tell somebody the other day that from a strictly biblical standpoint, there's no such thing as the popular culture contemporary heaven. Like, you die and you go to a place where you sit on a fluffy cloud and play a harp and look down on all the living people. Yet, as much as some people have affection for that idea, or they might find comfort in it, that family circus version of heaven is not real from a biblical standpoint. And I don't say that to poo-poo anybody or to tell them that they're wrong for believing in it, because it's not my place to sort of, and I don't want to just be a wet blanket for no reason. But if we want to understand the New Testament message or even the Old Testament message, understanding how they would have read the Bible tells us how we ought to read it too, right? I mean, that's the whole reason why our movement got started as the Churches of Christ is, what does the Bible say? Let's believe that and go back to the basics. So, if that means I have to tell you, I'm sorry, Grandma's not sitting on a cloud somewhere with a little halo over her head playing her harp and watching grandkids play, I'm not doing that to be mean. I'm not doing that to put down anybody for believing in that. But I'm doing it because I believe in the Bible and I want the Bible's truth to be taught and not man's ideas. So, I said all that to say, when we arrive in Zephaniah's time, and we look at the way he's portraying God, we need to be Zephaniah for all intents and purposes. And if we can't get there, we should at least be his audience. If we were there in the time of good old King Josiah the Reformer, the guy who's bringing back the Bible, he's restoring the theocracy of God in the southern kingdom of Judah. He is putting God back on the throne. He went out into the temple and read the law, and he said, this is important, this is what we ought to be doing as a people. I, as your king, institute this as a matter of law. That is the people to whom Zephaniah is speaking. People to whom exile is still coming. People to whom God's foregone punishment has already been sentenced. But a people whose hearts are more receptive to the message of God at this moment than in coming generations before this exile will ultimately happen. So when God, through Zephaniah says in verse 6 of chapter 3, I have cut off nations. Their strongholds are demolished. I have left their streets deserted with no one passing through. Their cities are destroyed. There will no one be left, no one at all. I said to the city, surely you will fear me and accept correction, and her dwelling will not be cut off, nor all my punishments come they were still eager to act corruptly in all they did. So he first says, I punish nations. You know this about me. You've seen it happen. You saw it happen to your neighbors to the north. The Israelites already got carried, is it just a few more years before the Israelite captivity happens? Once again, timeline's not my strong suit. But regardless, they've seen God come through and intervene when punishment needs to be meted out. And now God says, you know this about me. And this city, the city, Jerusalem, has been rebellious, and punishment will still be upon her. So these are people who probably are willing to accept their guilt and their sin to some extent. But this promise that God is still going to punish is not going to, that's never going to feel good, right? Like, as a teacher, I catch kids doing stuff every once in a while, and they're sometimes sorry that they did it, but they're always sorry they got caught. And it's not my job as the adult to punish the ones who are unrepentant and leave the ones who get why it's wrong alone. Right? It's my job to do the right thing in the situation because that teaches them, hopefully, theoretically, if we do it with love and respect and even-handedness, equality in this regard, that teaches them that there are consequences and to avoid that sort of thing the next time. So God is in a very sort of fatherly way here doing the same thing for his people. All right, I did a lot of talking. Any comments or questions?
It covered a lot of ground in the last 15 minutes, didn't it?
That's what I said.
Well, part of that came from just stuff that's been kicking around in my head for the last few days, and part of it came from this, something that I thought needed to be drawn out from here. Well, I don't like to just get information from people I agree with. I tend not to stay in my little echo chamber, my little bubble, and let people pat me on the back and tell me I'm right. So one of the places I go to have my ideas challenged are religious studies, experts, scholars, things like that, who look at Christianity from an outsider's perspective, culturally, historically, and all this other stuff, and critically look at Christianity to examine its place. Not necessarily to say why it's right or wrong, but where does it fall in history and how can we learn from it? That kind of thing. And one of the historians of religion that I study, the guy has a YouTube channel. Okay, and that's how I get it's an easy way to get information. And the guy's called Religion for Breakfast, and he's just a really well-spoken, easy to listen to informer on these topics. And he was talking about Christian heresies and Christian splinter groups from the time the church started all the way up until the Nicene Creed, right? And he's got all these so-called Gnostic groups that at the time didn't call themselves Gnostics. We historically look back on them and could give them that label because they all kind of fall into that one big basket. But now we're finding that label's not particularly useful because they have mutually exclusive ideas about things. They wouldn't have associated with each other necessarily, but historically what we're finding is they did associate with other Christians. So even though they have these really bad, really heretical, really outside of normal viewpoints on things, they still went to church with everybody else. They were still there in the assemblies with other Christians. And it's not like they did that and then they put their dark cloaks all up and went into their secret meetings and hunched around a candle and went, wah, we've infiltrated. But they were just Christians who happened to have sort of diverse views on things in their time. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is the idea of the Christian denomination, the Christian division, or the Christian orthodoxy is worldly and not biblical. And I think one of the great shortcomings of the Campbellite movement, to use a sectarian term, is that we somehow held this contradictory idea in our minds that sectarianism is bad and we are the only good sect at the same time. We've somehow figured out how to divide ourselves all the way out of division, so we're not divided anymore. I think the real role of the lineage of the Restoration movement, if we can have a new Restoration movement, not started by me, I don't want to be the chairman of this movement, I just think this is where the momentum is going, okay? I think if the Restoration movement has a job in the 21st century, it's to be the champions of unity in the midst of disunity. To find Christians, no matter what name they have, and call them Christians. Now, we do that by challenging heresy wherever it is. The Mormon heresy that believes that Jesus was not God, but a God. The Jehovah's Witness heresy that believes that Jesus was a created demiurge who had the job of dying on the cross but wasn't really of the Godhead himself. We can call those sort of falsehoods out while still talking to the believers that labor underneath them and say, the gospel still has a job for you. And there are more examples, and it's not my job to go through and tell you why everybody else is wrong, and we're right, because that's the whole point, right? Is if we believe in the Bible, we ought to find other Bible believers, whatever title they choose to put on themselves, and say, the only name we need is Christ, just like Paul did. In a loving and corrective way, and not in a, well, since I've done well figured out, let me tell you how that's all. Kind of a way. Because we all know what our reputation is. And I would like to take the best possible version of that reputation and actually leverage that into a successful movement for Christ. I think it's possible to take that weakness that we have as the people who are the only ones who think we're right, as they claim we are, and to say, well, maybe I'm not the only one who's right. Maybe we're not the only church who's right, but the Bible's right. And if we can get a yes on that, we can start talking from the thing we agree on. And we won't get everybody. But I think there's entirely plausible reason to believe we might get a lot of somebodies. So, and to tie this in with what Zephaniah is talking about here, when I say we, and I give you the job of being the church at Pursley who does some of this work, I'm not really talking about us, because it's like I was talking about on Sunday when I was talking about unity. God is the head of the body. Jesus is in charge. We're just the organs that operate underneath his command. We're just cells inside this big organization that grows and is given life from the head of Jesus. So I'm not telling you, as a member of the Church of Christ, you're to go out and to bring people into the true body. I'm telling you that our body has a sickness, and that sickness is division. That people already called under the name of Christ, already under the head, have been separated out while still remaining within. The flow of the lifeblood of Christ has not reached all the cells. I don't know. I'm extending this metaphor a little too far in a direction the Bible never took it. But the point of what I'm trying to say is, I'm not saying there's these people and these people and these people, we're grouping them in, but Jesus made the church, and unity comes from within the church and not from dividing people out. How can the eye say to the hand, Otherwise, how can the foot tell the ear? I can't remember how the parable goes, but you get the point. We as believers don't get to tell other believers they're not believers enough. We just correct them based on what we believe in. Now, we do this within the church pretty well. I mean, the other day, I had a member tell me that he had spoken to a fellow believer about a topic I had actually preached on. And the guy who had then gone and taught that had gotten in trouble with other believers for teaching from the Bible. Now, that's not division caused by correction in the Bible. That's division caused by man imposition of his traditions over top of God's commands and God's teaching, right? That's not someone coming in and saying, now you all have to listen to me. But somebody saying, I think the Bible says this, and somebody saying, yeah, no, we don't do that here. That's not right. You're stepping on my toes. We don't go that far. So, when we're looking at Zephaniah and the day he was in, and these people who had just come out of tribulation, trial, idolatry, bad religious practices, and what basically amounts to cheating on God with all these petty little gods that lived around them, small g, in the Canaanite religion, the Assyrian religion, the Philistine religions. And God says to his people in verse 14, sing, O daughter of Zion, shout loud, O Israel, be glad and rejoice with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away your punishment. He has turned back your iniquity. The Lord, the King of Israel, is with you. Never again will you fear any harm. On that day they will say to Jerusalem, do not fear, O Zion. Do not let your hands hang limp. The Lord your God is with you. He is mighty to save. He will take great delight in you. He will quiet you with his love. He will rejoice over you with singing. So if God exhibits that level of love for people who have been idolatrous just the previous year, how much more does God love people who say Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? How much more respect does God have for people who claim the name of Jesus every day and go out saying, you need saving from your sins? We might have sectarian divisions, but we have godly unity. The only thing dividing us is us, not God. So, he wants to comfort his bride, the church. Right? Paul tells us in Ephesians that Christ is married to the church, that is his bride, he's made a contract with us to cherish us, to protect us. And you know what the other thing a bride gets? The bride gets half of everything. The bride is the other half of the husband, right? We talk about this in colloquial terms and how we describe it. But it's actually just legally true when it comes to marriage, right? And not just in modern terms. When two ancient peoples decided to marry their son and the other family's daughter together, they recognized that the son's inheritance and the daughter's inheritance would get added to each other. And from like a purely legal land contract standpoint, they became a new entity. You think about this in terms of royalty, right? If this country over here marries their princess to this crown prince over here, well, that's basically a peace treaty. And it might even result in those two countries becoming one country when he inherits what he inherits and she inherits what she inherits. Well, suddenly their two inheritances are one big country. So if we think about it in that terms, when Jesus says, as the Son of God, the heir of heaven, that he has married the church, and Revelation tells us that the new Jerusalem descends from God's presence down onto earth, and there's no new heaven and no earth, for the first heaven and the first earth have fled away. There's now a new heaven and a new earth placed. We are now seeing a transformation of the world into a perfected image that reflects God's presence in heaven, now permanently here on earth. And so that's where we get back around to that conversation I was having with my friend at the beginning, right? Where I said, well, there's technically no heaven as we typically think of it. Because the more important thing that the Bible tells us about heaven is not you die, and if you're righteous enough, you go to the place where good people are. Heaven is God will take you, no matter how dead you are, bring you back to life, and make you better than you were when you were alive, redeem you from death, redeem you from sin, and cover you over with a new kind of life, so you'll be made out of the stuff He's made out of, and you inherit the same thing that He has given to Jesus. You take part in the inheritance that Jesus takes part in. In the book of Revelation, there is God on the throne. Pretty consistent. And you get to the very, very end of that book. And the one who is on the throne, at the very end of the book, if we go here to the message in, let's see, it's in chapter 22. Jesus is now the one who is occupying the place where the throne is. Okay, so in chapter 22, in the first verse, it says, "The angel showed me the river of water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb." So God and the Lamb occupy the throne, the Lamb being Jesus. And then it says in verse 3, "No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and His servants will serve Him. They will see His face, and His name will be on their foreheads." So God and Jesus now co-occupy this sort of role of kingship, but in the presence of all the people, right? The new heaven and the new earth have been established so that the redeemed will be in this place. Okay, so all of this has been established. Then we get to verse 17 of this. The invitation to join the Lamb and the one on the throne, God, Jesus and God are calling you, gets added to with verse 17, "The Spirit and the bride say, come, and let him who hears say, come." So at the end of the book of Revelation, we now see a different voice added to the message. And at the beginning of the Gospels, right, Jesus goes out and He calls people out of the world and He makes them disciples. Then He sends those disciples out, and those disciples call some people. And then those people get called the bride of Christ, the church. And then the church, the bride here at the end, calls people to her. So the gospel invitation comes from the Spirit and the bride, and let him who hears, in verse 17. So I have in the past had a sermon where I argued that Jesus commanding the apostles to go ye into all the world didn't apply to us. I actually preached that from the pulpit, and I think it's true. But the problem with that is I absolved everybody from the job of doing gospel work when the Bible doesn't actually do that. The gospel is actually all of our job, and it's right here at the end, because he who hears includes me. If you hear and you respond to the call of the bride and of the Spirit, you're one of the ones who says, come. So we get added into this, not just as people who participate in that eventual someday recreation, as people who have already been redeemed out of the world. The reason why it matters that there's no present contemporaneous heaven is because it might distract us from the fact that we are presently and contemporaneously redeemed here and now, and we want to do the same for other people. Not tenuously, not kind of, sort of, we hope, but remember, we are redeemed and we know it. It's not, Lord, sometimes I don't feel safe. Now it is, thank you, God, for saving me. And we live that redeemed life with confidence in God, faithfulness from Him, reflected in trust on our part. So, we're back in Zephaniah again. In Zephaniah chapter 3 and verse 9, there's a particular phrase that gets used here that I think is relevant to us in the modern Christian era. But it also reflected something that they were going through then. Chapter 3 and verse 9 says, I will purify the lips of the peoples, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord and serve Him shoulder to shoulder. There was one time in Hebrew liturgy, one time per year, that the high priest was allowed to speak the name of God. Do we know when that was? When he entered into the presence, when he went in the Holy of Holies and made atonement for the people. That one time. He is the only time in the actual liturgy. Now, people probably got away with saying it because I don't think God was in the habit of zapping people for saying His name out loud. But that was the one time in the actual scriptural commands that He was to, in a worshipful and reverent time, speak the so-called true name of God, and not Lord or all these other terms that we give Him, to speak with Him reverently that are not His name, per se. So, when Zephaniah the prophet, inspired by God, says He's going to purify the lips of the heathens, the non-Jews, the Gentiles, and the Gentiles will utter the sacred name of God, that is a transgressive thought. That is harmful to the psyche and the spirit and the good feelings of the Jewish people. Because suddenly the job of high priest is no longer reserved for one man born from the Levitical tradition. But now, every Joe Schmo has the ability to speak the name of the Lord, has, in fact, the directive to speak in the name of the Lord, and then do what? And serve Him shoulder to shoulder, is the end of that verse. So not only are we given the holy name of God and commanded to speak it, but we now have the job of doing the duty of serving Him as well. And on that day, in verse 11 there, Israel would not be put to shame. On the day when all of the Gentiles are speaking the name of the Lord and standing shoulder to shoulder and doing the work of God, on that day, Israel also will be filled with glory and pride and no shame any longer. God will truly rescue Jerusalem when the Gentiles are saved. What an interesting thought. What a really hard to swallow pill. But here we are. So when we have the job of speaking the name of God, we also have to remember one of the 10 Commandments. Now we might very conveniently say things like, oh, this only applies to us modern Christians. That's true. In directive, but not in principle. One of the main commands that we should keep in mind is do not take the name of the Lord in vain. Because as His bride, we've taken His name. We better not wear it vain. That's really what that word means. Okay. More talking on my part. Comments, questions, corrections, contradictions, snide remarks. Better not invite any of those. Save those for the for you afterwards. Well, I appreciate your kind attention on my comments today. I actually don't have anything further to say. So if there aren't any other comments, we will go ahead and conclude our discussion of Zephaniah. Sunday we'll pick up where our study continues in the book of Haggai and looking at a completely different time period. We're into King Darius again, back into Daniel's era. And so we'll be looking at that realm. And we'll just conclude from there and have our announcements and then into the teaching follow. Any updates from Sunday that we're aware of?
I have